34th chapter, Genesis 34. We're going to be going to this context again. Remember now, we are building upon what we began this morning. And so we're going to go through the same slides quickly just to bring everybody up to date. But the lesson, if we had to entitle it, it would probably be the high cost of low living. And again, we're speaking to our young people. About 3 months ago, we decided that every month here, we would at least speak to our young people one time. And we made them a promise at that time that we're not going to speak down to them. We're going to treat them like adults. We're going to treat them as mature. And so we're going to elevate them. We're going to challenge them. We're going to speak to them as God's young men and God's young ladies, and that's, I think, what we've done. But to our young people this morning, we told them, we are thankful for you. Thanksgiving coming up, as Eric said, we ought to be thankful for a lot of things, and our young people are one of those items that we ought to be very thankful for. We also said, we care about you. That's one of the reasons for these lessons, because we care. We know the time in which we're living. It's difficult. It always has been. And so we need this added instruction. Likewise, we want what is best for you. We know that you're trying. We know that you want what's best. And so we want to help in that regard. So we're going to Genesis 34. Remember what we've said about this word of warning. Again, this is a tough assignment because of the subject matter. We're dealing with sensitive issues that if we're not going to approach them maturely and reverently as the Bible sets them forth, then let's not touch them. But they need to be dealt with, so let's deal with them as God does, very reverently. And again, we said that sometimes we deal with some things that are repugnant to us. They are repulsive, and certainly we find that in this chapter. Why look at these things then? Because there are lessons to be learned. There are warnings that need to be issued. If through this study we could help one young person, anyone, avoid the problems that we see in this context, our time is well worth it, isn't it? And so, look at what we're doing. Dinah's downfall. We're looking at Dinah's decision. We're looking at Dinah's defilement. We are looking at Dinah's disgrace. And last of all, Dinah's deliverance. Now, we've already looked at this, Dinah's decision. And we pointed out, we don't know why she chose to do what she did. We don't know if she has any blame to be attached to her name whatsoever, and we're not suggesting that. We mentioned some possible scenarios this morning. We won't mention them, but here's her decision. Now Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the daughters of the land. That's all we're told. She went out to see the daughters of the land. She wanted to see how others were living. And so notice Dinah's defilement. Sad chain of events begin here. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, prince of the country, saw her, he took her and lay with her and violated her. This language is unmistakable. This is why we've said this context includes some things that are repugnant, some things that are repulsive. Again, he saw her. We mentioned from Job 31 and verse 1, the implication is he lusted after her, more than just seeing her. Again, remember Achan? He said, I saw, I coveted, I took. That's exactly the same path Shechem took. He saw her. He lusted after her. He took her. The implication there is by force. We mentioned that, and we'll see it again tonight. Verse 26, when Simeon and Levi, when they kill Hamor and Shechem, and the rest of the men, they go and take her. They took her from Shechem's house. And so we see from both of those verses, verse 2 here, verse 26, force is implied. He lusted after her. He took her by force. He lay with her. He lay with her. Again, a euphemism, if you will, for sexual activity. And he violated her. As Brother Jim read, he defiled her. Again, the language is clearly identifying a situation of rape. And again, even moreover, it seems like he took her to begin with and kept her, would not let her go back to her family, kidnapped her, if you will. And so Dinah, she wanted to see the daughters of the land. But while she is looking, someone else was looking at her and did not have the purest of motives in his heart. Well, look at this now. Dinah's disgrace. We're looking at verse 3. Notice what it says concerning Shechem. And now please understand what I'm about to say. This sounds good. And I think from the context, it is good. But this does not nullify what he did. At least he cared about her. He evidently had some proper motives. But once again, we can still do that what is wrong and have the right motive behind it. But notice what it says here. Concerning Shechem, his soul was strongly attached to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the young woman and spoke kindly to the young woman. And so let's look at what it says here. His soul was strongly attached to Dinah. Literally, in the Hebrew, his soul clung to her. He really did care about her. Had a strange way of showing his care. Stephen and I were talking a moment ago, and again, when you go back and look at the historians and the commentators, what Shechem did was not uncommon at this time in this land. And they didn't think it even really registered a sorry. Again, so this was something commonplace. But this man cared about her. You know, love doesn't seek its own. We know that. We know that love doesn't seek his own, and that's exactly what he did. He was seeking his own, but at least, he did care about her. His soul was strongly attached to Dinah. His soul clung to her. Look with me, if you will. Look at verse 8. Now, this is going to be regarding what Hamor will say to Jacob and his sons. But look what it says. Chapter 34, verse 8. But Hamor spoke with them, saying, the soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him as a wife. And so obviously the father here knew that my son really does care. The soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Again, evidently, obviously, there would have been a much better way to show that he truly cared. But notice, that's not all it says. It says, and he loved the young woman. And so his soul was strongly attached to her. He loved her. Now, once again, when you look at this, look at verse 19, because I think this comes into play. Now, there's two ways to look at verse 19 here. Look what it says, chapter 34 and verse 19. It's so the young man did not delay to do the thing because he delighted in Jacob's daughter. He was more honorable than all the household of his father. Now, the way the New King James reads is, this man, Shechem, was more honorable than all the rest of his clan. And you're thinking, if that's honorable, I'd hate to see the worst of the worst. If he's the best of the worst, I'd hate to see it after him. But there's another way to look at this. It could be he is more honored, meaning respected. But you know, when you read the context, when you're honest with what's said about Shechem, and if you listen to him and take his words and his father's words for face value as far as what is said about Dinah, it does appear that he has some honor, at least some integrity. He cares about her. You remember what happened in 2 Samuel, the 13th chapter? In that context, you read about Amnon, and remember his sister Tamar. And remember, the Bible tells us early on in that chapter that Amnon loved her. He loved her. Now, when he took her, and when he violated her, and when he defiled her, as you read through that chapter, after he was through, the Bible says, in essence, that his hatred for her now was as intense as his love once was. And so when you compare those two, Shechem and Amnon, at least this man cared. He cared about her. Doesn't right the wrong, doesn't even begin to right the wrong. But it shows that there might be something within this man. Again, he loved the young woman and spoke kindly to the young woman. Can you imagine how scared she must have been? How shocked, how sad she must have been? And so this language implies that he spoke comfortably to her, that he spoke kindly to her, that he was trying to reassure her that he truly cared, that he really loved her. In fact, in Isaiah 40, verses 1 and 2, God tells his prophet to comfort, oh, comfort my people, speak kindly to Jerusalem. Same Hebrew language here. Comfort them, speak kindly to them. And so, once again, we see this in the context. And after he saw her, and after he took her, and after he ravaged her, again defiled her, then we see this concerning the man. Does not make up for what he did, but it does show that there was something within Shechem that loved Dinah. Now, look at this next verse, and then we'll go back and fill in some of this because we're jumping all the way ahead to verse 26. And look what it says, and they killed Hamor and Shechem his son with the edge of the sword and took Dinah from Shechem's house and went out. Well, this is getting near the end of this tragic train wreck of consequences. Again, what happened in between? What happened? Now she's delivered, she's going to be, but what happened in between? Follow this with me. Take your Bibles. I hope you're in chapter 34, because look at just some of this. Look at some of this. Go back with me to verse 4. Verse 4, look what it says. So Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, get me this young woman as a wife. I think we can imply, rightfully so from this context, that at this time the parents were still arranging the weddings, the marriages. Get her for me for a wife. You go back to Judges 14, same thing Samson said to his father. Get her for me. And so these marriages were arranged by the parents. And so Shechem is saying, I truly care about her. I love her. I want to take her as a wife. Father, arrange this for me. Look at verse 5. And when Jacob heard that he had defiled Dinah, his daughter, now his sons were with his livestock in the field, so Jacob held his peace until they came. When it says here that Jacob held his peace, don't view that as indifference, that he just took this nonchalantly. And don't view this as cowardice. This is all he could do. He is totally outmanned at this time. It had to break his heart. He held his peace. as we'll read in just a moment, his sons would not hold their peace. Look what we find now in go down with me, I guess, to verse 8. Because, well, verse 7, I think we better read that. Look what it says. And the sons of Jacob came in from the field when they heard it, and the men were grieved and very angry. Stop there. Natural responses, natural emotions. They were grieved. This hurt them. This broke their heart concerning their sister. And they were very angry. Naturally so. They should have been. And so notice what it goes on to say in verse 7. Because he had done a disgraceful thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, a thing which ought not to be done. Now just scan with me verses 8 through 12, because this is when Hamor, the father, and Shechem are going to talk to Jacob and the sons. Listen to what they say. And now notice this again. One person said that this was a diplomatic masterpiece. And what he meant by that was he didn't bring up the Dinah episode. He didn't bring up his son and what his son had done. I don't think we can call it a diplomatic masterpiece. This is somewhat of what we hear today when our elected officials or others are caught and they come up with some kind of an apology, which many times is not even an apology. And that's what we're going to see here. There is no apology in what Hamor says. There is no, I did wrong, I am sorry in what Shechem says. But read it, look what it says. Verse 8, but Hamor spoke with them, saying, the soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter. Please give her to him as a wife, and make marriages with us. Give your daughters to us, and take our daughters to yourself. So you shall dwell with us, and the land shall be before you. Dwell and trade in it, and acquire possessions for yourselves in it. Now notice this. It's just, let's see how we can repair this wrong. And they don't even admit that it is wrong. But this is sort of boys will be boys. Now let's make a deal. That's about how it comes off, doesn't it? And notice this. In verse 11, then Shechem said to her father and her brothers, let me find favor in your eyes, and whatever you say to me I will give. Ask me ever so much dowry and gift, and I will give according to what you say to me. But give me the young woman as a wife. Again, this sort of underscores that he had deep feelings for her. He really did care about her. I'll pay whatever you say. But again, no admission of wrong. No, I am sorry for what I did. No, can you forgive me? And so notice, as you look at this in verses 13 through verse 17, look what we find here. The sons of Jacob, they're now going to respond. And look at verse 13 closely. It says, but the sons of Jacob answered Shechem and Hamor, his father, and spoke deceitfully. Make a note of that. They spoke deceitfully because he had defiled Dinah, their sister. So what they're about to say, there is guile in it. There is deceit in it. Did they learn this from Jacob? You know, Jacob was one who practiced deceit with his father Isaac, with his brother Esau. They're speaking deceitfully. And so notice what they say. And they said to them, we cannot do this thing, to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a reproach to us. But on this condition, notice they only have one condition to meet. But on this condition we will consent to you. If you'll become as we, if every male of you is circumcised, then we'll give our daughters to you, and we will take your daughters to us, and we will dwell with you, and we will become one people. But if you will not heed us and be circumcised, then we will take our daughter and be gone. They said, we've only got one condition. The condition is every one of your males have to be circumcised. And if you don't want to meet that, we'll take Dinah and we'll be gone. Well, in verses 18 through verse 24, this is presented to the men. They're going to accept those terms. And when Hamor and Shechem speak, they said, hey, they only gave us one condition. And then we also see the deceit in them. Hamor is sort of saying, hey, this is a good way to swallow them up. Then we can have their possessions. We can take everything. So a lot of deceit is going on here. But notice this. Notice this. Start in verse 25. It says, now it came to pass on the third day, when they were in pain, that two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, each took his sword and came boldly upon the city and killed all the males. The third day, we're told that this is when the wound reaches crisis. They are incapacitated. They cannot do anything. It was probably not only Simeon and Levi, it was probably their helpers, their servants, but they went and killed all of the males. Again, this is why they spoke deceitfully. Did they have this plan from the very beginning? Possibly so, when they told them this. And so look at verse 26. And they killed Hamor and Shechem his son with the edge of the sword, and took Dinah from Shechem's house and went out. Now, drop down with me to a couple of verses. Look at verse 30. Jacob, when he hears about this, he's not pleased with this either. He wasn't pleased with what happened to Dinah, no doubt about that. And he's not pleased concerning the answer that his sons came up with. This was a crime against humanity also, and he wasn't about to endorse it. Look at verse 30. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, you have troubled me by making me obnoxious among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And since I am few in number, they will gather themselves together against me and kill me. I shall be destroyed, my house, my household, and I. So notice, he says, we got to move now. We got to move. Now, there's more than just the move, okay? But again, look what you've done. We're odious now. We're obnoxious in the sight of the people now. We can't stay here. And once again, just like Hamor and Shechem offered no apology for what was done, Simeon and Levi offered no apology. They don't say, Dad, we've thought about it. We did wrong. We are sorry. Look what they say in verse 31. But they said, should he treat our sister like a harlot? They feel justified in everything that they have just done. Well, a tragic story. Terrible consequences. Let's see if we can have some lessons learned very quickly. Think about this first one. Every decision you make, again, young people, and those of us who are older, let's think, because there's lessons here for us. But every decision you make, even the most innocent and trivial, can have far-reaching and long-lasting consequences. You go back to verse 1 after you've read the whole chapter, and you sort of say, what began this was Dinah wanting to see the ladies of the land. That's all she went out to see, the daughters of the land. And from that trivial choice, all of this happened, all of this transpired. And so, again, every decision you make, young people, it's important. Every decision, even the most innocent, even the most trivial. Do you remember in 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 6? Remember what it says there? Paul says, a little leaven leavens the entire lump. Even a little decision can bear tremendous, huge consequences. Song of Solomon, chapter 2 and verse 15, the little foxes spoil the vineyard. And so again, it might be little. We might play it down. This is just something little. We might even tell our parents, why are you getting so upset? Because in our minds, this was trivial. In our minds, this decision, we made it out of innocence. But again, in your parents' mind, they know where this could have led to. And so every decision, again, same thought in a way, let every decision you make be a wise one, for it'll impact the rest of your life and the lives of others. Every decision potentially can end up just like this one. And so it's going to impact your life. It's going to impact the lives of others. Think about what we read today. At the end of this, Hamor and Shechem are dead. That's how it impacted their lives. They've been killed. And Simeon and Levi, they receive, if you will, a curse from their father on his deathbed concerning their anger. Again, think about Jacob. He's to live the rest of his life with the knowledge of what was done to his daughter. And as we noted, and this is not the most important thing, but he had to leave the land he bought, probably giving up what might have been a lucrative business, all of that. And then Dinah herself has to live with a broken heart. And so every decision you make, let it be a wise one, a very wise one. Again, this world's moral standard is totally different from God's. That's one of the lessons we see here. I hope we see it. Again, Jacob had integrity, but he's living in the midst of people who had no integrity. And young people, we're right there. The moral standard that the world has, if there even is a standard, it's not God's standard. It's not the same standard you are living by. It is totally different. Remember Isaiah 5 and verse 20? Woe to you who call evil good and good evil. That's what they were doing in Isaiah's day, and that's what's still going on today. They're looking at God's standard of what is good, and they say, no, that good's evil. And they're calling evil good, a different standard. By far, when you go back and look at the book of Esther, chapter 3 and verse 8, Haman is trying to convince King Ahasuerus to let him have his way with the Jews. He wants to annihilate all of them. And remember what he says, King, there's a certain people scattered and dispersed in all of your kingdoms. Their laws are different from our laws. Now that was true to a certain extent. Their laws were different because, they were following God's law. And so you can flip that around. Just like the world can look at God's children and say, they've got different laws, we can look at them and say, they certainly have different laws. Now Haman misused that truth because that's only true if they violated God's law. It's like Acts 5 and verse 29. We must obey God rather than men. And so if our laws, the laws that we're living by God's, if the law of the land is in compliance with that, we're going to be the best citizens that this world has. And the only time we're going to object, the only time we're going to be disobedient is if their laws are in contradiction to God's law. And we have to make a choice. Who are we going to obey? Then we must obey God rather than men. That's the only time, though, that God's law is different from the world's, when theirs does not comport with His. And so the world's moral standard is totally different. You remember in 1 Peter, the 4th chapter? Peter is talking to those who have become Christians. They've come out of this world. And he says that you're no longer to live according to the lust of the flesh, but for the will of God. There's the difference. This world lives for the lust of the flesh. As God's children, we live for the will of God. And it's so different that later on in 1 Peter 4 and verse 4, 2 verses later, those that they used to run with, they think it's strange that you no longer run with them to the same excess of dissipation. And so the world, ex-friends, they're looking at you now and they say, we don't get this. You used to hang with us. You used to do what we did. Now you don't do it anymore. They recognize there's something different. There's something different. God's moral standard is totally different than this world's. You remember we already mentioned that this morning. Jeremiah 10 and verse 2, do not learn the way of the nations. That's what Jeremiah told his people. Don't learn the way of the nations. Why? Their laws, their moral standard is totally different than God's. Again, Romans 12 and verse 2, we're not to be conformed to this world, but transformed by the renewing of our minds, that we might prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. That sums up God's will. It is good, it is acceptable, it is perfect. You can't say that about the world's will and their moral standard. And so the world's moral standard is totally different from God's. Notice this, when looking for Mr. or Mrs. Right, make sure that they are right with God first. That's so important. We're always looking for Mr. Right, Mrs. Right, and sometimes we don't connect the dots. We're not asking, are they right with God? Is this Mr. Right with God? Is this Mrs. Right with God? That's what ought to come first. Not, are they beautiful? Are they handsome? Charm is deceitful, beauty is vain. But a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. And so notice what we put here. Look at this. Otherwise, Mr. or Mrs. Right is really wrong. That's the reality. If your Mr. Right is not right with God, he's Mr. Wrong. If your Mrs. Right is not right with God, she's not Mrs. Right. She's Mrs. Wrong. Notice, God intends for marriage to be honored and the marriage bed to be undefiled. You remember Hebrews 13 and verse 4? Again, let marriage be held in honor among all men, and the marriage bed be undefiled, for adulterers and whoremongers God will judge. And so God, as he instituted marriage in Genesis, the 2nd chapter, this has always been his will. This is from me. This is not your idea. This is not your brainstorm to come up with. We didn't come up with marriage. It's God's plan. And God has always said, I want my plan. I want my first institution to be held in honor among all men. And if we hold that in honor, the second part of that verse is never going to happen. The marriage bed will never be defiled if we hold marriage in honor. Notice, our world is an incredibly wicked place, and we live in an exceedingly evil day. Again, young people, this is not to scare us. This is not to make us so immobile that we're never going to leave the house again. This is to help us be sober and vigilant, to understand that we have an adversary. He prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. And so we are to be sober. We are to be vigilant. You remember in Philippians, the 2nd chapter, verse 15, Paul talks about an adulterous, an evil generation. You remember Paul in Ephesians 5 and verse 16. Again, we're to redeem the time. Why? The days are evil. And so our world is an incredibly wicked place, and we live in an exceedingly evil day. Now, here's the good news. Here's the good news for young and old alike. Read this with me. The Lord's church is an incredibly wonderful place, and we live in the midst of exceedingly encouraging brethren. That's the reality. Oh, not to scare us. We should know that the world is dangerous. Yes, it is. It's a dangerous place. What should that help us to do? To cleave together, to be knit together. Remember the language of Colossians 2 and verse 2? To be knit together in love. Within the church, young people, you're going to find an incredibly wonderful place. And within the church, you're going to find exceedingly encouraging brethren. Why? Because, again, they're thankful for you. They care about you. They want the very best for you. Even as we've come full circle in our study today. That's how we began. So we've looked at some things. Yes, some things that need to be looked at. We have tried our best to look at these things reverently, in a very mature way, so that all of us can learn lessons, so that we can become stronger, that we understand this is one of the reasons why God tells us to put on the whole armor of God, that we might be able to withstand the evil one, able to withstand his fiery missiles, able to withstand in the evil day. Ephesians 6, verse 11, verse 13, verse 16. Young people, you remember what John says? I've written to you young men because you're strong. The word of God abides in you, and you have overcome the evil one. 1 John 2, 14. You can do it. You can live the Christian life. You can do so faithfully. You can be a blessing to mother and father. You can be a blessing to everyone you come in contact with. But we better remember these truths. We better be wise in our decisions, every one of them. There's not one decision that you make every day or that I make that doesn't have consequences. Let's seek first the kingdom and its righteousness. And God makes a promise, all these things shall be added to you. Matthew 6 and verse 33. We rejoiced this morning when our brother Jason Bird was restored. He'd already asked God for his forgiveness. He came seeking our prayers and our encouragement. It was an encouraging moment. Maybe there's someone else here tonight. You need to be restored to your first love. Let's take care of that. You need to be baptized into Christ, the greatest decision you'll ever make. Why not make it tonight if you're ready? If you're willing to count the cost, what did we talk about today? The high cost of low living. You better count the cost. If you're living in sin, you better count the cost of that decision. And Jesus says, now hold on, before you come to me in Luke 14, I want you to count the cost too, because I don't want you to become just as a beginner. And you just begin and then fall away. I want you to finish. So you count the cost. There's a high cost. It's really a very low cost in comparison to what God has done for us. But we might call that the low cost of high living instead of the high cost of low living. God wants us to love Him. He's done everything to ensure that we should love Him. If you need to come tonight, making your life right with the Lord, let's do so while we stand together as we sing.